Always excited on Off the Podium to learn about some stories that perhaps some people aren't overly familiar with in this part of the world, but some people might be familiar with in other parts of the world. And today we're going to talk a bit about volleyball. A brand new book has been released. It is called If Gold Is Our Destiny, How a Team of Mavericks Came Together for Olympic Glory. And it tells the amazing story of the US men's volleyball team that went on to win gold in 1984 at the Los Angeles Olympics and then went on to become the most dominant volleyball team of the 80s. And the incredible story about this is that prior to the Los Angeles Olympics in 1984, the US men's volleyball team had never won not only an Olympic medal, but a medal at any major tournament. This group of men that came together and turned a fledgling system of volleyball in the US into a powerhouse. It's an amazing story. And we are here today to chat with two people heavily involved in this book and also that great program of the 80s. First of all, the author of the book. It is a pleasure to welcome off the podium, Sean Murray. First of all, Sean, thank you so much for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you today.
Great. Thanks, Ben. Really happy to be here to talk about this team and the story.
And also joining us, the team, the story, the head coach of that team from the 1984 Olympics, coached the US men's volleyball team between 1977 and 84, and then later on between 97 and 2004, played on the US men's volleyball team as well in the 70s, and is a member of the International Volleyball Hall of Fame. Doug Beal is with us today as well. Doug, absolute honor to have you on the show today as well to chat about this today as well.
Thanks, Ben. It's a pleasure, and I think Sean did a wonderful job capturing this story, and I'm delighted to join you and talk about it.
It is such an amazing story because sort of someone in Australia, we're not really that exposed to volleyball, not a sport that is widely, I guess, publicised here. And it's kind of one of those things that I think a lot of Australians are maybe a bit naive. We think America, dominant in all sports, you've been dominant forever, this is just how it's been. But when you learn about a story like this, particularly a sport that was invented in the US as well, that it took this amount of time for there to be a level of success, it's an incredible story. I mean, Sean, I'd love for you to just briefly tell the story about how you came about writing this story, because you have a bit of a personal connection to this team and to why you obviously chose this subject to write for a book.
Yeah, well, it started about 5 years ago. My wife gave me a book as a gift for my birthday. It's called Boys in the Boat. I don't know if you or your listeners are familiar with that book. It's very popular in the United States, and it's an Olympic story as well. It's a story about the 1936 men's crew team represented the United States at the Olympics in Berlin, and that crew team was actually the varsity crew team at the University of Washington, which isn't far from where I live here in Seattle, Washington. And so the book sort of started as a regional success, but it really blossomed across the country and became a bestseller. And my wife handed it to me. I didn't know anything about the team. I read the story. It's a great story. It's very inspiring. And I teach leadership and organization development, team building to corporations here in the States. And I thought to myself, wouldn't it be great to have a story like this that I could use to teach others about how to build a winning culture, how to build a winning team, how a group of people come together to do something that's greater than the whole and creates that sort of cult dynamics and cohesiveness that we're always looking for in teams, whether it's in sports or business. And so I started thinking about, well, what team could I write about? And it occurred to me I had a connection to a team. My father, Don Murray, was the team sports psychologist. He called himself a team psychologist. He was really there to help the team build the kind of culture and help work with the inner dynamics and the relationships between players and coaches. He worked with Doug Beal and his partner, Chuck Johnson. The two of them worked with Doug and the rest of the coaching staff in the early 80s to try to help these young players become a team. And I was at the Olympics in 84. I was 13 years old. I'd gone because my father was, part of what Doug called the team around the team. So I remembered this group of players. They were really had a great personalities. They caught the attention of the country. They certainly caught my attention. And they won a gold there in 84. And so I thought, maybe I could write about this team. I knew they'd won a gold, and I knew that they had been on an outward bound, which is kind of I don't know if that's popular in Australia, but it's a kind of wilderness course, a 3-week course before the Olympics. And so they went on that. We're bound to sort of build team as a team building and building cohesiveness on the team. And so I knew those 2 facts, and I thought there was probably a story there, about how this team came together. My original idea was the book would, at the end of each chapter, there would be, points that would tell the reader, here's 2 or 3 lessons you can learn from, this part of the team's journey. But that ended up being, it sort of broke up the narrative, and it wasn't great for the reader. And my editor, we eventually said, no, let's just tell the story. The readers are going to figure it out anyway. And luckily I made that decision because it's been well received as a story, just the story in itself. And I think it's a fun, dramatic story of how this team came together. But also, if you read it, the subtext, if you're interested in how teams come together and how people work together to build something bigger than themselves, there's also that. There's the lessons that we can all take away. And whatever organization, whatever we're doing in our lives, we always are working with teams. And so we can, I hope that readers can also take away those lessons. So that's the genesis of the book.
Well, as I mentioned to you off air just before we started recording, I read this basically in a day. It was that compelling, sort of going through it. So the narrative works very well. I'll just put it out there the way it kind of flows with everything. Doug, what was the phone call like when Sean called you up and said, hey, I've got this idea for this book? I mean, obviously yourself remained involved in volleyball post the 1984 Olympics and went on to some other great things. But I mean, was this something that you were looking forward to going through the memory banks to relive that obviously great moment in your life that you helped coach the team to that gold in 84 and everything that built up towards it?
That's a great question. I thought this kid's never going to do this. So I'll humor him a little bit. It's almost it's challenging even to remember the first call because Sean did just a remarkable job here and stuck with it and worked. I can't even imagine how many hours. And so I certainly was happy to help. The relationship with Sean's father was a special one for me and all the rest of the members of the team. Don and his partner were quite impactful, I think, in a lot of the decisions that we made and a lot of the things that we did, which were unique and different at that time in sports. Sean mentioned the Outward Bound trip. Those kinds of team building activities are much more popular, much more common today. There's a much broader range of activities that teams can engage in. Nobody was doing something like that back in the early 1980s. And the concept that Don and his partner brought to us was really unique and interesting. And we can certainly talk a lot about it. So I can't remember exactly. There are so many people who interact with you when you're in the Olympic world who want to tell your story or think it's remarkable or tell you how terrific you are. And very few of them honestly follow through. And Sean was just remarkable because there were periods where he was writing a lot, and there were periods where he had to take care of his life. So you're writing a book that consumes you. Part of it, for sure, is the connection to his father, and it's a close connection and a wonderful, I think, ode, frankly, to the work that his father did his whole life. But there were peaks and valleys, and sometimes I wouldn't hear from Sean for some months, maybe longer, and other times he was sort of all over me. But it's hard to overstate how wonderful I think it is that he told the story and the unique perspective that he has. And I tried to help as much as I could and certainly shared whatever files and archives I had from those years. And it's much different than trying to archive things digitally and electronically that we can do so easily today. But I can't I don't know, I can't be more grateful for the work that Sean did, because it's a fascinating story, and hopefully it resonates like it did with you. I think that's terrific.
Well, just on that, I'd be intrigued to know, Sean, obviously you mentioned in the book about how popular this was in 1984, how the entire country got behind it. But as the years have passed, is this something that is still widely known among American sporting circles, or has this kind of faded away a little bit more to a little bit just in the volleyball circles? Because you compare it a lot, say, to the Miracle on Ice in 1980, which is widely known, but is this a story that is still often talked about, or is this kind of a opportunity for people to remember how big of a deal this was, nearly 40 years ago now?
Well, in my experience, generally this team has not remained in the forefront of the sports consciousness of this country, especially compared to the 1980 upset against the Soviets at Lake Placid that we call the Miracle on Ice. And so in many ways, this is a chance to revisit that, to shine a light on it, to remind people of what this team did. I think in many respects, what this team did compares very favorably to what the hockey team did. I know there were different circumstances, but you mentioned before that the men's volleyball had never before medaled. So this is a team that went from 2 years before the Olympics, they were ranked 13th in the world, or they came in 13th at the World Championships, and they knew they had to make some changes quickly because the Olympics were coming. And so a big part of the book is about how they go from 82 to winning gold. And it's just it's a great story that, frankly, when you talk to people in the States today, they remember a few names. Sometimes Karch Karai is the name that many people remember. There's also a player on that team named Steve Timmons, who has a great personality and went on to win multiple gold medals. And so some of the personalities and people, but when you do run across people that remember the team, they remember it very fondly, and they're very interested in learning the backstory of how it happened. And so I'm hoping that this book really brings it to light. Also, I just want to mention that the Olympics are coming back to Los Angeles in 2028.
Yeah.
And 9 of the 12 players on this team were from, I'd say, the greater Los Angeles area, Southern California for sure. 3 of the players were from sort of the Midwest, and 9 were from Los Angeles, which is really unprecedented as far as a team that's comprised 75% from a host city of the Olympics. It's not just that they were playing in their home country, but these players were playing in their home city in front of their friends and their family. And they were very well known in Los Angeles at the time. Many of them learned how to play volleyball on the beaches of Southern California. So there's a lot of special elements to this team. And I hope that as people read the book and becomes more popular, that it will be more fondly remembered, just like the 80 hockey team.
Well, I'm just making a bold prediction now because we like to do it on the show. Obviously, 2002 Salt Lake Olympics, the Miracle on Ice team lit the cauldron. So in about 6 years' time for the LA 28 Olympics, potentially some of the guys, Doug, you might get the call up there, light the cauldron for the 28 Olympics. Would that be something that we can put out into the universe now to happen in 6 years' time?
I think that's one of the best suggestions I've heard recently. I like that a lot. Yeah,
You're welcome.
I appreciate. The '84 Olympics, in many respects, it's been described this way, kind of saved the Olympic world. They were honestly the only bidding city at that time. They had a really unique relationship with the International Olympic Committee. Perhaps they developed the current marketing popularity of the Olympics and the sponsorship programs and the broadcasting revenue that has grown so dramatically. But it was a remarkable games in many respects. Our team being so dominated by local talent was just one element. It was incredibly popular, coming off of the boycotted games in Moscow and the really I wouldn't say disastrous, but financially disastrous games in Montreal in '76 that really pushed a lot of potential bidders away from the games. So it was sort of a watershed games. And I don't know that the 2028 games will be quite the same, but there's some interesting elements to those games that might change the Olympic movement, the Olympic world internationally. Again, they're not building a single venue in 2028. That's going to be the first time that that's ever happened. I think Paris obviously is coming up in a couple of years, and they're going to have a pretty unique games as well. But Los Angeles is a remarkable city for the games, much like Sydney, I think, and London, and some pretty unique locations. So we'll see what happens. But lighting the cauldron would be, we accept.
Good. I don't have much sway with the IOC, but there's still time. Who knows where I could be in 6 years to help out with that. So
I'm waiting for a call now from Thomas Bach. I'm sure that'll come anytime.
We'll make sure that happens. But I mean, just on that sort of in the lead up into '84, Doug, of course, you played on the team in between 1970 and 76, and Sean explains in the book sort of the narrow misses really that Team USA had not qualifying for those Olympics. I mean, did you harbour sort of growing up that ambition to become an Olympian? And I mean, was that always designated to volleyball? Had you had other sporting pursuits that maybe you kind of pursued to harbour potentially an Olympic dream?
It's interesting. I don't recall growing up as one of those kids that says, I'm going to win an Olympic gold medal. That's the most important thing in my life. I played a lot of different sports. Sports was certainly a big part of my life. I got introduced to volleyball in a unique, interesting way. I didn't come from a part of the United States where the sport was particularly popular. There were only a few pockets during the years I was growing up where that even was possible, mostly in Southern California and a couple of other smaller areas. I got lucky. I was introduced to the sport pretty early. There was a connection. I loved it. Something about the rhythm of it, the teamwork, the skills of it that connected to me that I loved. And so I played it even though it wasn't a high school sport. It was barely starting as a college sport at that time. I did play a year in college at Ohio State, which has grown. The program has grown dramatically, and now it's one of the sort of the icon university programs in our country. I wound up coaching a little bit at Ohio State, which was an interesting experience. And I say this to a lot of people. The era that I played volleyball, almost everybody did some coaching. You almost had to. The structure was so undefined that if you wanted to play at a high level, you had to organize the players that you could attract. You had to put teams together. There was very little college volleyball, almost no high school volleyball. It was all sort of amateur club volleyball, and what's now USA Volleyball was called something different, United States Volleyball Association. Their national championships was the peak competition in the country at that time. And there were college teams that went to that, but they were not at the top. So I don't know. At some point, I just got more and more involved in the sport, and I got involved in the administration of it or the leadership of it in a certain way, which a number of other players / coaches also did in that era. And a lot of us had these ideas as players. We have to change what we're doing. This isn't working. We're not very good. We're not competing with the best teams in the world. We're going to these competitions. We're selecting our team every year as though we're starting from scratch. It's sort of an all-star team. We're not training very, very much. We're not playing very many competitions. It's not working. That's not a model for success. And clearly we didn't have much success. And so in a sense, it was easy to say, we have to change everything. And gosh, there were so many people that were integral to that. But the leadership of our volleyball association was receptive to that. They weren't happy either. And as you mentioned in the lead-in, volleyball was invented in the United States. This sport started in Holyoke, Massachusetts, back in the late 1890s. It was, for us that were really involved, that was embarrassing. It was kind of humiliating and really frustrating. And we always had thought, we've got some really good players here. We could play at a high level. There had been a few random moments where a U.S. team at an international competition would win a match and then lose 5. And so there were these sparks of wonderful performance that just reinforced our belief. If we changed enough, we could be a leading volleyball country in the world. And so, as I say, it wasn't that hard to think that everything had to change and everything had to be done in a different way.
Which is really well written out in the book, explaining that journey. And Sean, you sort of mentioned about, telling that story about how this all came about. I want to talk about Outward Bound shortly, but just everything in the lead up to that. I mean, your father, sports psychology, not something that was really a big thing in the 80s or the 70s. So sort of those steps there. And ultimately, Doug, sort of going on to what you were saying there, the creation of a hub, which initially was in Dayton, Ohio, then moved back to California, and even just sort of detailing the divide that existed between, say, the beach volleyball community, the indoor volleyball community. I mean, today most people just assume that because beach volleyball is an Olympic sport now, that, you can easily forge a career in both. But of course, in the 80s, beach volleyball was still a long time away from becoming an Olympic sport. So all those elements that kind of went into building it. I mean, Sean, were you, I guess, learning all of this as you were going along? Were you sort of aware as a child, learning from your dad about the efforts that were being putting into this to kind of turn this program into the success it became?
Not as a child. I mean, to me, it was, they had won the gold. I watched them win the gold as a 13-year-old on television. I didn't get to go to the gold medal match. My parents were only allocated two tickets. There were 5 of us in the family. And so most matches we all went to, but on that match, it was just my parents. But, to me, I had, looking at hindsight at 84, it's like, well, of course they won. They had great players. I mean, I'm sure it just all came together. And I think a lot of people have assumptions like that. You've got great players and they come together in practice and they go on to win gold. And there's just, as we all know, there's just so much more to the story. And as I started to uncover, kind of peeling back the layers, I realized, what went into building that team. And that's what I was hoping to discover as I researched the project. That's why I wanted to write the book, is to really show and demonstrate at least what one team did to overcome some of these challenges. And they had a lot of talent. They had a sort of a golden generation of talent that arrived when the training center moved from Dayton, Ohio to San Diego in 1981. And Doug Beal had previously been the coach in the late 70s, and he remained the coach. So he signed on for another 4 years. A number of great players came on, and the talent was there. The skills were there. They just weren't playing together as a team yet. They weren't, or maybe I should say, they weren't yet realizing their full potential. And that's where good coaching, leadership, working together, building trust, trying to figure out what the different role is for different players on the team, trying to figure out what kind of commitment we're going to demand from these players, and how are the players going to react, trying to help them bridge a divide between beach and indoor, or between the East Coast players and the West Coast players, and were the players that had played at USC versus the players that had played collegiately at UCLA or Pepperdine. There's all of these issues that needed to be solved. There was also the issue of, what kind of offense or strategy or system is the team going to use? And that ended up being a very fascinating part of the story, because the team creatively developed something called the American system, or the American style. And it had never been utilized before. It was something that they innovated. And we can get into that. But one thing I want to point out about that system was that it wasn't something that was imposed by Doug Beal and his assistant coaches. It wasn't imposed by the players alone. It was something that came from working together in practice, trying things, what if scenarios, and trying to figure out what system would allow the unique skills of these players with these personalities and kind of the cultural background of America where they grew up, that they could utilize and bring them together in a way that brought out their full potential. And that really got me excited about the project. And as I come back from interviews and learn more, it was almost like a detective. I was a detective trying to figure out how this thing came together, and I'd get little pieces and clues, and the fun part was sort of writing it for the reader so the reader can kind of see how it all happened.
I can imagine it's addictive. I can imagine that as soon as you get a little carrot that somebody will say one thing, you'll go, oh, like, as you're saying, a detective, I want to explore that more. So then all of a sudden are you ringing up the next person going, oh, I've got another 3 hours today. I can do this shit, whatever. The wife can wait. The kids can wait. I get on board, do this quickly.
Yeah, there was a lot of that.
It just kind of all plays out that way, which, I mean, it is fascinating reading just that trial and error and everything that you explain about how this American style came about. And Doug, I can imagine for you just implementing these, the constant trying of things that were failing and then things were working. And then ultimately I can imagine too, when you're trialing these things in practice, and then ultimately you want to work it out when it comes out to a match. I mean, was this something that on the level of being addicted to things, mentioning there with Sean, were you back then, Doug, kind of had a notebook where you're working things out going, well, this can work, this can work? Was it almost like an addicting thing for you to work out the trial and error of all these things that you ended up trying?
There was a lot of that, of I think, trial and error. I was thinking, or while Sean was talking, while you were asking Sean some questions, there was no such thing, for example, as a concept of we have to create a certain culture, which is so common in sports today. What's the culture in your gym? What's the culture of your team? You have to create a culture. I think we did create a really interesting culture because we set standards that had never been articulated or imposed, at least in the world of indoor volleyball at that time, and some demands that were pretty unique. The very good volleyball players up to that point just were so good that they knew they would get selected to the team each year, even though it was a year-by-year sort of structure. And so we put together some long-term plans, some goal setting, some a strategic plan of where do we want to be, how do we get there? And I think where do you want to be is the easy part. It's really not challenging to talk to players or coaches or any kind of experts that you have around your team, physiologists, doctors, biomechanics, whatever the team around the team is, and say, what are the objectives here? What are we trying to get to? And so you can put down win-loss records, you can put down statistics, you can put down winning competitions, you can do all that. The challenging part is to create a structure that allows you to have a chance to achieve those end goals. And I think we did a pretty good job of that. And I think we also did a pretty good job of saying plans change. It doesn't always work exactly the way we'd like it to work. There are bumps in the road. Players get injured. Players change priorities. Other teams get better, faster. Some of the systems that you think are going to be really successful aren't so successful. There's so many factors that go into this process that you have to be willing to change. I think we did that really well. I think we weren't afraid to say, this isn't working, we have to try something else. And I also think we were in a sense, really good listeners, except with our eyes. This group of players, I think almost any time you achieve something that's unique or special or significant, there's a lot of talent involved. And sometimes the talent is not just in the obvious ways, the best hitter, the best blocker, the best server, the best passer, etc., the skills of the game. Sometimes the talent is how that person affects other people, their commitment, their ability to gather the other players to the process. We all need to do this better. We had a bunch of those kinds of personalities on the team that were sometimes very dramatic leaders, very dogmatic, very out there, very strong personalities, and sometimes just by how they participated in every day in practice. So I think, gosh, there's so many factors that go into this, but we changed a lot. And, earlier also, either you, Ben, or Sean were mentioning about the popularity of the team. It's really interesting. First, it was remarkable that Sean was able to interview in depth every single player, I think with only one exception. They all responded. They were all engaged. That speaks a lot to their commitment to this team for not just the 4 years leading up to winning a gold in '84, but continuing on, winning another gold in '88, essentially really dominating the world for a 6-8 year period, maybe longer, and coming from this really low point where there were 15 countries regularly beating the United States, maybe more. And so one of the elements that I think is really captured in this book is when do the players take ownership of this team and they drive the ship? And they did that. For sure, we threw out some crazy ideas, but nothing that we did that was so crazy was stonewalled by the players. And they, whether they understood it or they didn't understand it, whether we understood it or not, they bought into, we have to change a lot of things, which means a special level of commitment. Excuse me. So I just think Sean did a great job of capturing that in this book.
Well, one thing that was nearly stonewalled by the players, Outward Bound. Fascinating story learning about all of this. Sean, please explain a little bit more about this kind of 3-week hike through the wilderness, which again is something which a lot of teams and athletes kind of tend to do now, but back in the early 80s, this was not something that a lot of sporting teams were doing, was it?
Yeah, I think I called that chapter a crazy idea, and I got that from one of the players, Paul Sunderland, when I asked him what his reaction was when he heard that the coaches wanted to take the team on a 3-week outward bound wilderness experience. He said he thought they were nuts. He thought they were crazy. But where the idea came from, it was hatched almost a year and a half before the players actually went on the outward bound course, maybe a year, 12 to 18 months probably, where the coaches got together with my father, Chuck Johnson, another team sports psychologist, and they were throwing around ideas, how they thought this team could improve the dynamics, how they work together, building trust, build the relationships. That really, I believe, is the X factor for when you get to the elite level that these players were playing. The Soviets had elite talent. Brazil had elite talent at the time. Korea, Italy. I mean, there were a lot of teams that had great talent and players that with skills. So what's the X factor? What's going to put your team over the top? And it's how you play together as a team. It's how you work together. It's in the passing and in the, working as a team, right? Towards your strategy and alignment. So they wanted to create that. And it wasn't just happening naturally. It wasn't just developing, even though they were spending, I think Doug mentioned there's 10,000 hours in the gym together one year, which is a lot of training time, way more than the national team does today. And they thought, well, perhaps we could take this team on a shared significant life experience. Something they would do together that was significant, a life experience outside of volleyball that would help them build relationships and bonds and trust. And the first idea was to take them through boot camp, which is the U.S. military here in the United States. That's where you go for 6 weeks or 8 weeks to learn how to become a soldier. And there's a huge Marine base just outside of San Diego. And they contacted the base, and I always mention that because I just have visions of this team going through boot camp. It's kind of funny to think of some of these players, Doug, crawling under the barbed wire or whatever, going through the mud. So the Marines said, no, we're not going to take you through boot camp. And so the next idea, Plan B, was Outward Bound. One of the coaches had an experience with this international group called Outward Bound, which specializes in designing courses anywhere from a few days to a month or more, taking small groups through wilderness experiences, and where you learn resilience and you learn how to survive, to navigate and orienteer, and you learn about yourself. You also learn about the group you're going through with. And not many of the players had experience, especially in the winter time. It was decided that this would be a winter excursion. They located the course in a part of the United States that's really beautiful, stunningly beautiful, near a national park, Canyonlands National Park, which is just this beautiful sandstone canyon area, and also some fairly high mountains, not as high as the Rockies, but they're called the Abajo Mountains in southeastern Utah. And it was designed to be 3 weeks over 100 miles, with the players and the coaches were there as well, carrying 70-pound packs, snowshoeing, each night trudging through the snow, setting up their tents, clearing out their tents. And what's interesting about the experience there is I was interviewing players, and also I got to interview, they weren't called guides, they were called instructors. They like to call themselves instructors, because a guide would be someone that you were relying on to show you the way. And an instructor was there to teach you, and then you were going to do it yourself. And that's really how the instructors want things to play out at Outward Bound. And so they were instructing the team on how to survive. And the instructors wrote these beautiful trip reports where I got so much information about what was happening day by day, which allowed me to sort of recreate for the reader what happened. You can just imagine taking these young men out of Southern California. They're used to the beach. They're used to the really warm weather and their feet in the sand. And all of a sudden it's below freezing. It's snowing. It's all the way down to 5 degrees Fahrenheit. It is bitterly cold, and they have to work together to survive. And I think that's the first big piece that happens on Outward Bound, is how they have to relate to each other in ways outside of the volleyball court. They were used to relating to each other on the court, where there's a certain hierarchy, and the better players at the top of the hierarchy. And out in the wilderness, some of the players that were on the bench became very valuable. And each player had to rely on their teammate to survive equally. For example, as you go through in snowshoes, someone has to break trail. Someone has to be out front pushing, 30, 40, 50% more effort, because you're the first one breaking the trail. And then that person goes to the end of the line, and the next person goes. So just getting from point A to point B was a teamwork. When they arrived at the campsite, someone had to clear the snow out. Someone had to gather some firewood. Another person would start cooking dinner. Someone else would put the tents together. So together they would get ready to take care of each other. And actually empathy for one another is another big point of emphasis in Outward Bound. So that was another part. But perhaps the biggest factor in all this is the players didn't want to be there, didn't really understand why they were being asked to go, felt like it was a distraction from their goal. Several of the players said something along the lines of, well, we know we can get better playing volleyball in the court, in the gym. How are we going to get better at volleyball, snowshoeing around the mountains of Utah? And it was a very courageous move by Doug and my father and Chuck Johnson and Bill Neville and the whole coaching staff to try this experience. To Doug's point, they weren't afraid. One of my favorite quotes in the book is Doug Beal said at one point, we weren't afraid to look foolish and try something different. And this was definitely trying something different. the American system that they developed was definitely trying something different, and they did look foolish at times. And some people did call for Doug to be removed as the coach because they thought, who's crazy enough to do this trip? Who's crazy enough to instill certain rules on the team that alienate some of the best players that leave the team and so forth. And so Outward Bound was this experience where these young Southern California men came together to do something that they'd never done before. And when they left at the end of the 3 weeks, they related to each other in a different way. And it showed up. The team captain, Chris Marlowe, later said it showed up on the court in subtle ways. And I think that's true. And I think it showed up in practice because it was after Outward Bound that the team had the trust to do the trial and error, what if, innovative steps that were required to build the American system, to kind of innovate that American system, where they had 2 passers in the back row instead of 3, which was one of their techniques. And they also had a very creative offense that allowed the creativity and the uniqueness of some of the players to really shine. So it took that trust to develop, to innovate. And I think that came from the Outward Bound experience, but it certainly was because the players didn't understand why they were there. As they were going through it, and even shortly after, I'm not sure they really understood how it was helping the team. From a distance of 30, almost 40 years now, I think it's more relevant, or you can more easily see how it potentially contributed.
And I can imagine for you, Doug, that's a case of once you win that gold medal, it's first of all, I told you so, that helped on the way there. But was that something that then was implemented permanently? Like when you were coaching in 2000 and 2004, were you doing similar things, whether it be Outward Bound or something related to that?
I've not found administrators that would allow you to do anything like this ever again. I mostly think they say now, you're so lucky that nobody was seriously injured or hurt. There's so many parts to the. Sean explains it quite well. We really felt with that team that we had the potential to do something special. Up to that point, we had sort of been playing volleyball like every other country. And one of the things Sean writes about in this book is that if you want to be better than teams, you can't just copy what the teams ahead of you are doing. You certainly have to understand it. You have to understand why they're good. And you have to understand how to make that happen within your culture, within your physical talent, within your national identity. I think we did that much better after the World Championships of '82, where we finished 13th, and had some of those moments again of really remarkable play, but not enough. And to be good, I think most coaches would tell you in any sport, if you're good over time. You don't just rise up occasionally and have a remarkable performance. You have to be able to replicate that over time. And part of that is you have to believe in each other. You have to trust each other. You have to recognize the value of every player. Sometimes you get stuck in seeing people on a team, especially in a team sport, just as they are in that sport environment. And so you develop this hierarchy that is based solely on skill and performance. And one of the things the Outward Bound experience did, I think, for us as dramatically as anything else, was it gave us a different hierarchy. All of a sudden, players that might be a little in the middle of the pack or lower down because of their ability or their starting or not starting rose up or went down because of their skills in a completely different environment, and the need that the other players had to depend on them, which is what happens certainly in a team sport, but now was happening outside of that team sport. And here's a player that didn't have the most respect or the most status, and all of a sudden is performing in a really critical way, where players' safety may depend on that player, and so they see that player differently. And I think that does build trust, and I think it builds cohesiveness, and it builds teamness, which are hard things to define, but we did that pretty well in my view. And there was this for the rest of the experience from through '84 and then even beyond. Players always had this experience to refer to, and when new players came on the team, oh, you didn't really get to experience Outward Bound. You don't really know what being, taken into this extreme experience is really like. You have it so easy now. So that's important. I think having a tradition, having something to fall back on and to point to creates a strength and a continuity and a really strong fiber network of a team and a program. And I think we did have that. And that team went on to just get better and better and better over the next 4 or 5 years after the '84 games. So,
one thing I would love to learn a little bit more at those '84 games, Tom Selleck. Now, Sean, you mentioned a little bit in the book about him sort of being involved with the team a little bit, and I'd love to hear sort of, Doug, how that came about, because I mean it's all well and good to look back now on Tom Selleck as somebody who is on Blue Bloods now, but for the '80s he was Magnum PI. He was a huge star in the '80s. Not to say he's not now, but obviously different times. But how do you get someone like Tom Selleck? Because it wasn't just a case of let's get a Hollywood star on board, was it? He was actually a volleyball player, I believe. So I mean, Doug, tell me about Tom Selleck, and did he help you win a gold medal in '84?
You could write multiple chapters about Tom Selleck. First, he was just a wonderful human being. He did play volleyball. He played it seriously. He was a good athlete. He was filming his Magnum PI series during those years in Hawaii. One of our coaches, Tony Crabb, was a Hawaiian native. There was a connection. We were able to make a contact. And he was receptive and eager to help a national team, an Olympic team, and especially one that he played. He played in senior volleyball at that time, and he was a good player. And he did almost anything that we asked of him, and he loved the connection of being around this group of athletes. And he was at the Olympics, and my recollection is he was at every match, and including visiting our locker room before the gold medal match against Brazil. And wow. one of my recollections is, so this is, you're playing for a gold medal, and we had lost to Brazil earlier in the tournament, and we're at home, and 14,000 people. And anyway, and Tom was invited in, and he was really nervous. This is one of the biggest stars in the world at that time. And as you say, still a big star. But at that time, he was really like a sex symbol. I mean, he was just about as popular as you can imagine anybody being. His show was one of the top rated shows, maybe the top rated. And he walks into that environment, and I remember Bill and a couple of players had to sort of pick up the context because he really didn't know what to say. It was an interesting juxtaposition of most of us would be sort of tongue-tied and not sure how to act around him in his environment. Here he is in our environment, and just as, I don't know, feeling maybe a little bit out of it, but he was just wonderful. He allowed us to make a couple of posters that we sold and kept the revenue for, which was significant for us at the time. And in addition, we played some exhibition matches with his senior team against a group that we put together. We played one in San Diego that I remember particularly, a couple in Las Vegas. He just gave of his time to be connected to this team, to assist us in almost anything that was reasonable that we would ask for. A wonderful, down-to-earth, terrific guy. His son had played some volleyball at USC, so he had a connection in a couple of different ways. I can't say enough for how much he helped us and how much credibility he gave at a time when the sport broadly needed it in the United States. So it was some terrific memories of his involvement.
Did you ever try and sneak in a cameo or Magnum PI, or did he ever ask? I mean, Chris obviously was a bit involved in Hollywood, so I don't know if that helped him get a walk-on role on Magnum PI at all.
I haven't talked to Chris. I'll have to talk to him about that. But I remember one time we were in Las Vegas, and we played an exhibition match. Tom was there, and after we finished the exhibition match, which was terrific and helped us raise some much needed revenue. But the most important thing was the exposure. We went to one of the casinos. Tom was so popular that when he went into the casino, they had to rope off an area around, I don't know, the roulette table or the craps table or wherever we were playing, honestly, to keep him from being mobbed.
Wow.
And we were all invited in. It was just wonderful to have these sort of juxtaposition experiences. We're in his world some, he came into our world some. Just a wonderful down-to-earth guy and helped us immeasurably in so many ways in the lead up to the 84 games and in fact at the Olympic tournament in Long Beach.
I wonder who they get to do that in 2028. Tom Cruise, post Top Gun fame. I mean, I don't know how
he's got some volleyball background there in the original Top Gun. Huh?
Exactly. Not sure how that works. Sean, I mean, for yourself, with all the interviews you did and everything that kind of went along with writing the book, was there one standout story to you that stood amongst the rest, that was the one that maybe you enjoyed writing about the most, or that perhaps it was something you didn't know about and then writing about it really kind of fascinated you in when you were learning more about it through the process?
Boy, there's a lot of them. I guess one story that really captured me was related to Chris Marlowe, the player we were just talking about, who Chris was the captain of the team at the Olympics. And Chris is now the play-by-play announcer for the Denver Nuggets. If there's any NBA fans out there listening and you ever tune in to the Denver Nuggets, you'll hear him do play-by-play. He's an announcer. But at the time, Chris was the oldest player on the team, and he was battling to be the backup setter to Dusty Dvorak, who far and away was the best setter on the team, and who Doug Beal has described as probably one of, if not the best setter that the United States has produced. And he's right up there. And so, Chris was trying to battle to be the backup setter. And he was 31 years old at the time, wasn't quite in his prime athletically, but what he was in his prime, and has probably always remained in his prime, is the kind of person that with a certain charisma and leadership ability and ability to inspire others to perform at a higher level, to elevate the play of his teammates. It's something that some players have. And as I researched Chris and went deeper into his history, in high school, he played basketball at Pacific Palisades High School in Los Angeles, which has had some great players go through there, including Steve Kerr and Kiki Vandeweghe, who are big stars in the NBA. They had never won a city championship except for his senior year in high school. And his coach credits the camaraderie and the team work that was on that team that Chris captained. When Chris Marlowe went to college, he played both basketball and volleyball at San Diego State. And the San Diego State volleyball team, when he was captain his senior year, won the NCAA championship. It's the only team sport that San Diego State has ever won at the NCAA level in the United States, across any sport, men's or women's. And he was the captain. And then Chris went on to play on this team. So we just lost a sports giant, a human being who was incredible here in the United States in the sports world, Bill Russell, because we're recording this on August 1st. And
Yeah.
Bill Russell. I actually talk about Bill Russell a little bit in the book because
You mentioned about being one of Doug's, I believe one of your heroes, Doug, which, yeah, it's kind of sad that happens to be today that we're recording that, unfortunately.
Yeah, I haven't had a chance to talk to Doug about that yet, but this was, when I was interviewing Doug, he looked to the Celtics as a team that had success over time. They didn't just win one championship, they won 11. Every time they went on the court, they were competing. And that's where this team wanted to be in the early 80s. They wanted to elevate there. And what the Celtics had was Bill Russell. And I came across a Bill Russell quote just over the weekend as I was reading about him and his life and some of the great tributes that have been written about him just in the last 24, 48 hours. He said, the most important thing I did on the court was to make my teammates play better. And because he was the consummate teammate, he wasn't the highest scorer for the Celtics. And Chris Marlowe was not the highest scorer. He didn't spend a lot of time on the court, actually, during the Olympics. I don't know how many minutes he actually had. Doug will have a better idea, but he certainly was not on the court at the critical points, but he was very critical to the team. And how he got to be, and I'll just tell the listeners this, I hope you'll read the story, and I don't want to give away too much, but I will tell you that roughly 3 to 4 months before the Olympics, he was cut from the team. Yet he ended up becoming the captain, and how that plays out, you'll just have to read the book. But I think that story really caught my attention, and I hope people can relate to it, never to give up, and to be ready and to understand the importance of different roles that people play on the team. It's not always being the high scorer. It's not always being the MVP on the court. Sometimes it's about helping your teammates become better and finding players like that. And Doug said earlier, eventually great teams, leadership emerges from the team. And I think Chris was an example of that. And then Chris retired from volleyball at the national level shortly after the 84 Olympics, but he sort of passed the torch on to Karch Karai, who had a similar impact on his teammates in that he did something that brought the best out of everyone. People look to Karch as setting an example of what's possible. He held himself to such high standards and held others, and was so focused and determined that he got everyone around him to play better. And Karch was, in my opinion, the captain that led throughout this 6 to 8 years of dominance. Karch was the player, just like Bill Russell was the player for the Celtics. But Chris Marlowe kind of got it going. Chris was there. Karch was pretty young at those Olympics, still just barely out of college. So the Chris Marlowe part of the story, it really spoke to me. And that's why he's on the cover too. He's holding the American flag. It's I hope listeners get a chance to read about Chris and his journey.
I was very fascinated reading about Chris and everything along those lines, definitely. And as you were saying, sort of that whole just attitude he had to really gel that team. One thing I actually just wanted to quickly ask Doug, just mentioning Karch Karai, the GOAT of volleyball, but talking about sort of almost like a coming full circle moment. Obviously, Karch won 3 gold medals as a player, but recently, of course, basically about a year ago at the time of recording this, led the US women's team to their very first ever Olympic gold medal. Is that something as a coach, knowing that you achieved that for the men's team, that you kind of have now that connection to the women winning their first gold, that obviously you're probably proud seeing him going on to win those medals as a player, but for him to be a coach, achieve this success for the women's team now, I mean, how did that make you feel when the women were able to do that last year, led by one of your former players?
Karch is a remarkable human being. In every sense of the word. I think the accomplishments that he's achieved in volleyball and frankly in life are Bill Russell-like, very honestly. It scares me sometimes when I think back that I almost didn't hire him as our women's national coach. And that looks like that would have been the most foolish omission or decision that I could have possibly made. Yeah, he's just done some really special things in the sport, and it is wonderful. He's grown tremendously. He's always been this super focused, accomplished athlete, but he carries it far beyond that. And he studies and he works at it and he listens and he just solves problems immediately. I've said this to so many people. As an employee of USA Volleyball, they're extraordinarily fortunate that Karch has become so committed as a longtime national team coach, and as long as he wants to do that job, he ought to be in that position. He's really he's changed, I think, in some respects, his outward personality to adapt it to the changing structure of the national program. He's done some, I think, just special things in terms of integrating new players into the women's program. The culture that he's created is special. So yeah, I feel great, obviously, about the time I got to coach this remarkable player that had a huge impact on the men's national team, and then went on to do perhaps even more remarkable things on the beach side. And then coach, I don't know that anybody will ever match the achievements of Karch in the sport of volleyball.
Of course, the only player ever to win a gold in both beach and in indoor. Incredible achievement. Before I let you guys go, one quick question. Obviously, we mentioned the Miracle on Ice. They made a great movie called Miracle. Kurt Russell played the coach in that one. Great movie. Sean, if they were to make your book into a movie, is Kurt Russell playing Doug? Who's playing Doug? Like, I mean, you know, give us some ideas out there. Tom Selleck. I mean, that could be a great sort of full circle moment.
Actually,
I'd be honored.
That is a fantastic idea to have Tom Selleck play Doug Beal. Yeah, I the movie thing is it's fascinating because a lot of people do tell me, the book's been out for 2 or 3 weeks now, and the number of people that really would like to see this made into a movie is pretty remarkable, because it does have the elements of a made for Hollywood movie. You almost couldn't write the script. I mean, it's like one of those things where the fiction, you just couldn't come up with it to outdo what really happened. And so we'll see. There is some interest. You never know with these things, but I think it would be fun if it actually happened.
It would be perfect tie-in for 2028. Like, I mean, again, we've still got 6 years. There's plenty of time to cast, film this thing. And I mean, Hollywood is smart enough that they could do this and release it like in the lead up to the games. I mean, that's perfect tie-in. And then when you guys are lighting the cauldron, Doug, like you could be like, hey, you were also in that movie, and Tom Selleck could join you up there lighting the cauldron. There you go.
Yeah, he and I could hobble up there together. Yeah, I think.
I don't want to hear this Michael Phelps business about him. Oh, he won all these gold. He should light the cauldron. No, like this is LA. Come on now.
That's right. Let's get a local team that achieved greatness. Yeah, that'd be great.
Exactly. That's how it should work. The book, of course, If Gold Is Our Destiny, How a Team of Mavericks Came Together for Olympic Glory, is available now. If you're listening to us in Australia, Amazon, Booktopia, great places to get it. If you're listening to us outside of Australia and Canada, the US, online, Amazon, other retailers, Barnes & Noble, places like that. Sean, just quickly for yourself, anywhere people can follow you on social media if they want to sort of stay up to date with not only your writing, but obviously you do some great stuff as well. Give yourself a plug if people want to get involved with anything else you're involved in.
Yeah, if you want to learn more about what I'm doing, I also have a page about the book at my website. It's Real Time Performance, all one word, REALTIME Performance. That's my company where I do consulting around leadership and organization development. I also am on Twitter at Sean P. Murray and then 111, so 111. So Sean P. Murray 111. You follow me there. I'm always posting about leadership and building teams and crossing over into the sports world and end up tweeting a lot about volleyball these days too, to my surprise. But I'm kind of getting caught up in that world too. But please look for me there if you want to follow what I'm doing.
And Doug, social media, anything people can follow you, or are you just happy retirement, golf, doesn't matter?
Zero. Yeah.
Zero.
I'm trying to accomplish some so far unattainable goals in golf. No social media, zero social media.
Weirdly jealous of that fact. Guys, this has been an absolute pleasure to chat with you both on Off the Podium. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Ben,
right,
thank you.
thanks,
This
Ben.
was really, really a pleasure.